All right, so we're going to be in Acts chapter 24, and we're going to try and get down through about verse 12 in chapter 25. And we'll go ahead and look at the first big chunk of text there, chapter 24, verses 1 through 21, is basically just the account of Paul coming before Felix and giving his defense against the Jews and the high priest and a guy named Tertullus, who is an advocate, a lawyer, and seemingly a very well-known or very famous orator. And so was there anything in that section that you guys noticed or that you thought was interesting?
You know, Stephen, I think knowing a little bit more about Felix might be appropriate as this Roman orator starts talking about how great he was and so forth and so forth and so on. But Felix, as I understand, was a slave, probably to the service of a lady by the name of Antonia, was the mother of Emperor Claudius, and she granted him freedom, and then he later on rose up in Roman society, and what he found favor, became even into high command in the army, and then later on the governor of Judea. But he was anything but a good guy. He was very, very ruthless in his dealing with any who opposed him, as we'll discuss in just a minute, I'm sure. So I read something here where it talked about how he, one of the historians, ancient historians, Tacitus, summarized his evaluation of Felix. He said he thought he could do any evil act with impunity. He practiced every kind of cruelty, wielding the power of the king with all the instincts of a slave. He actually slaughtered many. He succeeded only in fanning the Jewish hatred, if you would, of Roman rule. So as a background, kind of who he was as compared to the flowery speech and so forth that was done by this orator in just a minute.
Yeah, to kind of add to that, we were talking a little bit last week about Paul's statement with Ananias, and so I did some further reading, and there's a lot of confusion about who is the high priest. And when I say confusion, what I mean is the Jews would appoint a high priest for life, and the Romans came in and treated it like any other political office. They would appoint them, and when they weren't happy, they would unappoint you. And so it was cycling through. And Felix was no different. In fact, Ananias had been the high priest. This isn't the Ananias that is mentioned earlier in the Gospels. It's a different Ananias. But he had been the high priest. He was deposed or removed and actually sent to Rome to be put on trial. And the emperor exonerates him and sends him back. And so in the meantime, Felix had actually appointed a guy by the name of Jonathan to the high priesthood. And then he decided he didn't like Jonathan, so he had him murdered. He just didn't mess with even deposing him. He just kills him. And so then when Ananias comes back, it's unclear whether he is appointed to the priesthood again, to the office of high priest, if he just kind of steps into it and takes over. Nobody really knows. I can't get a clear picture of what's going on. And so when Paul says over in chapter 23, I didn't know he was the high priest, there's a reason why. Nobody knows if he was the high priest, but he was just kind of filling that role. So yes, Felix is not a nice person, and he is more than happy to murder you if he feels like it's going to further his political agenda. Any other information you guys might have about that background, or?
No, I do think it's interesting just what's in the text here about Felix. That Felix, when Paul talks about him, you know some of these things, and it's then when they make more accusations, it says Felix had more accurate knowledge of the way, and the way here is, I think, the same way that Paul's talking about when he says the way that I worship my God. So I'd love to know, and I don't know that there is a way to know really, but I'd love to know how Felix had come to that knowledge and how Felix it's interesting how he applies that knowledge as we get a little further in to the discussion, but and especially the late part of the chapter. But it just fascinates me that Felix somehow has an accurate or more accurate understanding of the way than the Jews seem to have.
That might help to explain why he's not swayed by Tertullus and all his friends. So what do you think about the accusations that Tertullus makes? So that would be what verses, the half of 2, second half of 2 down through about verse 8.
You can tell they're really appealing to the Romans here, where it's not necessarily any accusation of anything spiritual, or what Paul's actually teaching is that they're accusing him of riots. They're accusing him of being a nuisance, which is similar to something Paul dealt with. I believe it was back in Ephesus when the riots came through because of the silversmiths. And it's just interesting to see that the way that they come across the accusations that this guy's causing all this ruckus of all these things, which you would think would be common knowledge if they were such a big deal. And that's what prompts Paul's response going on here, but nothing spiritual at all in nature.
And that might be, to that point, that might be why the Jews bring Tertullus in, is their thinking is that maybe he knows, he has a Roman name. Now, whether he is a Roman or whether he's maybe a Greek Jew, we don't know. But he apparently knows how to appeal to the Roman sense of legality. As he doesn't make any arguments, really, about the law, at least not substantive ones that we can see in his statement. So, yeah, I think you're right. He's trying to come at it from a Roman perspective.
And also the accusation of him being a ringleader in verse 5, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. I don't think has that term been used to describe Christians anywhere else?
That was a common phrase, a common way that the Jews would refer to them, is the sect of the Nazarene. In fact, there's actually a church that calls themselves the Church of the Nazarene, even this day. Even to this day. So it's I don't know if this is the first time it shows up in the text. It might be, but it became a pretty common name that would be used to describe the Christians. Does anybody else know? Is that the first time this shows up? It might be.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. To my recollection, I haven't seen it show up before this.
Yeah, you see the way a lot.
Yes.
So is anybody using the New King James or the King James Bible? You may notice if you have the ESV, you may notice that it goes from verse 6 to verse 8.
Oh, okay.
There's another, depending on which text. So there are some manuscripts that have a verse 7, and basically verse 7 says, I don't have it in front of me right now, but it basically says that the Jews were going to take care of Paul, but the Lysias steps in and interrupts the process of justice. And so it's almost like the argument is, if your Roman hadn't gotten in the way, we would have handled this on our own already. And that kind of maybe helps explain verse 8, where he says, if you examine him yourself, you'll be able to find from him that what we're saying, basically he's saying that he'll tell you what we're saying is true. I don't think he would say that about Paul, because Paul's about to disagree with him. And any lawyer any prosecutor in a court who thinks that the defendant is going to agree with the prosecution is probably not a very good lawyer. And so it seems to be that's what is going on. And maybe verse 7 was added to kind of clarify. But anyway, if you notice that you go from verse 6 to verse 8, that's why.
Mm-hmm.
It is interesting when you look at these accusations that go through there in verse 6. Paul's going to be very specific in refuting them. I mean, he's going to lay it out in almost a single sentence. He's going to obliterate all of these charges literally. And it struck me as I was reading this again, how much legalese, how many, I mean, just pure out and out legal terms go back and forth in this conversation. But it is interesting that, Paul really he lays it out after he tells Felix he's glad to make his defense. He's just going to say, look, here's 3 things they found. And all 3 of those things are exact answers to the charges that they made about him in verse 6 and thereabouts.
So that may be a good time to
also, I was going to say, Bob Hope had something to say about it. It said they called him a ringleader, and verse 6 says that he even tried to desecrate the temple. One this all this, so they were sort of walking back a little bit in chapter 24 to say that he tried to defile the temple, and now he's saying that, they're saying, well, but before in chapter 21 they said he did it. So this shows how tenuous their claim is.
That's a good point.
I do think it's interesting though that he is so easily answers what they say, that they say he stirs up riots, and he says, no, actually, I didn't have any crowd with me. This is down in what, verse 21, 20, verse 18. He says, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. So he answers that one without a crowd. In verse, then he says, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He said, they found me. And then third, he says he tried to profane the temple. And he says, they found me purified in the temple. So it's funny how in one sentence he just answers all of their charges that they made against him.
I also find it kind of interesting that, well, with what you said about verse 7, about referencing Lysias getting in the way, because in verse 8, when Tertullus says, by examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him everything which you accuse him. But if you go back to chapter 23, Claudius Lysias wrote a letter to Felix saying, we didn't find him guilty of anything worthy of death or imprisonment. So I think it's interesting that either this guy didn't know about that letter, or perhaps emboldening to Paul if Paul did know about the letter, because that was to prevent their attempt to kill, the Jews' attempt to kill Paul.
Yeah, I would think that they didn't know about it, because that would have been a private letter from Claudius Lysias to Felix, and so they probably didn't know. And
Which
so
may have been why Felix was more open to hear what Paul had to say.
Yeah.
So for clarity, the real charge here against Paul from the perspective of the Romans would be that he's an insurrectionist, right? And saying that, the Romans don't really care what the Jews are doing according to their own law. But if he's an insurrectionist, then this can get problematic for the Romans themselves.
Yes, which is why I think that word plague in verse 4 is used.
Yeah.
One of the commentaries that I looked through said that was a common word that they would use to talk about insurrectionists, because it spread like an infection. And so he's basically saying, if you don't cut him off, it's going to cause other issues. So I think you're right. I think you're exactly right.
Well, you also see where Paul is saying here that he refers to these 12 days, and of course you subtract the 5 days it took him for him to get down to Caesarea, leave 7 days, so he's in kind of inferring, says, how in the world can I accomplish much in 7 days as far as insurrection. There's not a lot of time. So.
Kind of going back to what Tim was saying earlier about how Paul just answers all of their accusations very quickly. Mm-hmm. Another thing I thought was interesting is he basically says, they don't know what they're talking about. If there are people who have a charge against me, let them come and make the charge. But what these people are doing is they're offering hearsay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just interesting that some of the same principles that we have in our courts today were present in the ancient Roman courts. Hearsay wasn't admissible. Or it wasn't supposed to be. I guess that's what we'll say. It's not supposed to be allowed.
Yeah, the contrast between Paul and Tertullus. I used to think Tertullus was kind of flowery. I think that's probably overblown. Now I don't think it's that much, because Paul is kind of, I won't say flattering, but he uses some of the same niceties. But I think the difference between Tertullus and Paul really is that the charges that are leveled by Tertullus and the Jews are super generalized, and Paul answers with extreme specificity. He talks about dates and exactly what they saw, what he could prove and contest. It's very interesting to see how Paul handles himself here. It's meticulous.
To tack on, Tim, even the way Tertullus addresses Felix at the beginning more or less appeals to his id, right? That it is only through you that we experience peace. Whereas Paul, on the other hand, starts his argumentation based on his experience as a judge in such matters.
Another thing that I thought Paul did that was very clever is he mentions that they agree with him, that the Jews agree with him about their hope being in what the prophets have said. And then down at the end, he said there was this one event where I was involved and there was kind of a little ruckus, and it was before the council. And it's when I started talking about the resurrection of the dead. And really, that's why I'm on trial before you today. So he puts the Jews in a position where they're either going to have to deny the resurrection of the dead, so they have a reason for Paul to be arrested, or they're going to have to admit that they do agree with him about what he is saying. And so it's one of those things where it's almost like the flip side of what would happen to Jesus, where the Pharisees came to Jesus with unanswerable questions, and now Paul has kind of turned that around and given it back to them. Here's something that you can't give a good answer to. And so it was brilliant.
You could probably sum it all up by saying these legal proceedings that were mounted against Paul were almost just a spectacle of dishonesty from the get-go.
All right, so let's move to the next section there, the second half of 25. We can look at, I guess we'll look at verse 22 down through about verse 25 or so. Right before, let's just do the rest of the chapter, 22 down through the end. Is there anything there interesting that you guys noticed or thought was any insights that you might have?
Well, with regard to what was brought up earlier about how Felix may have known some ins and outs of Jewish culture, it seems to be related with verse 24. His wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, may have played a role here in clarifying some things.
It's interesting that he would marry a Jewish wife, or instead of thinking maybe in that way, that should help us to see how far some of the Jews had gone in adopting Roman culture and customs, because he probably would not have married a woman who was strictly observing the law. He probably would not have married her if that was the case. She doesn't seem to be ignorant of the things. In fact, she seems to have interest in what's going on, but she's probably not a very strict follower of the law of Moses, if that makes sense.
I read where she was pretty young, around age 20 or so, is where I read. That's true from the one of the historians and everything. She was the youngest daughter of Herod Agrippa, who's the same Herod who beheaded James. So, but she was familiar with customs and the fare of the Jewish people. I'm like you, Steve, but I don't know exactly how in depth that was.
It is interesting there that Felix makes a choice that doesn't seem to be in, Eddie, you were talking about Felix earlier.
Yeah.
He makes a choice that does not at all seem Felix-like, just like Pilate made choices that don't seem Pilate-like when it comes to Jesus. Felix makes sure that his friends are not prevented from helping him, that he was to be kept in custody, but I think that the English Standard says given liberty. There's a lot here that Felix does for Paul that he certainly didn't have to do for Paul in any way, and yet he does. And again, this is one of those things that, like, if Felix was one of those guys that didn't particularly have a lot of scruples, and yet he makes these choices, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and in the end, likewise, Tim, he basically gave in to the wishes of the masses, just like Pilate did with Jesus. Good point.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated by the fact that usually when we see Peter or Paul before an authority, that their defense is always all about Jesus. And in Luke's account here, we're given one sentence that he talks to Felix about Jesus, but the rest of Luke's account about this interaction pertains directly to Paul's defense of himself, which I think is interesting. It's kind of different. We're seeing something different here.
I do wonder if that's because what we've got here is a case where Paul he has a direction he's trying to get, and it's not here. That he's basically not wanting to just get stuck and mired in Jerusalem when he knows he has bigger aspirations than just going back to Jerusalem, and in fact doesn't have any interest in going back to Jerusalem.
But boy, did he take that opportunity, though, that was presented to him for 2 years. 2 years trying to convince Felix, changing his mind. That's amazing dedication there. And just to think about what Felix ultimately did to him, regardless of that.
The thing that interested me about that particular section more than anything else is obviously the content when what we're told specifically that Paul talked to Felix and Drusilla about, which is this, he talks to him, and the interesting word there is, and the English Standard's probably a little soft on this from what I read. It says he was alarmed, and from all that I read, a better translation is what the American Standard has, which is terrified. It's a much more fear-inducing thing, and the question that I put in my text was just, what did Paul say to make Felix so terrified? Because what we have here in this sentence and in this phrase is basically just three things that he talked to him about: righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment. And I wonder what it was about how that's tied together that made Felix so scared. Because I wonder just what that says to us sometimes about how we present the gospel. Are we soft, a little soft in presenting it? I don't know. But whatever Paul said about to Felix about the gospel was enough to scare Felix. And I know oftentimes we say we don't want to scare people, but something he said did scare Felix.
Yeah, the self-control there is the same word that we looked at a couple weeks ago. I think it was a couple weeks ago in Galatians with the fruit of the Spirit. And it's the idea of restraint. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of doing what's right, restraining the evil, and the judgment coming upon the people who don't do what's right or don't restrain evil. And I think when you kind of consider maybe what Eddie had talked about at the beginning, Felix had a lot to be scared about. He's not a good guy. And I mean, you kind of get a hint of that here, where it says, that he was hoping that he would be given a bribe. That was supposed to be something that Roman governors were beyond. You were not supposed to be able to bribe a Roman governor. It would happen, but they were supposed to have the strength of character to the point where when you got to that level, that you couldn't buy them. It just kind of shows you who he is.
Yeah.
But
No doubt Paul succeeded in bringing some type of guilt to Felix's conscience, for sure. He definitely was afraid. He may have trembled in fear or something, but something actually did really trigger him in his thoughts. And he had a lot to think about from the way he acted for some time. So
it makes me wonder, cultural influence goes both ways. It's not like the Jews were only influenced by the Romans. The Romans get influenced by the Jews too, to some degree at least. And the God that is presented in the text of the scripture is very different than the Roman gods. And when you look at the Bible, it presents to you a God that actually is attractive. The Roman gods, there isn't really anything about the Roman gods necessarily that would draw you to them. They don't love you. They're not going to take care of you. But the God in the Bible does. And so he is this compassionate and loving father versus these other, very selfish and egocentric deities that are more concerned about their own desires than they are about loving or taking care of people. And so I wonder if Felix, especially having a wife who is at least half Jewish, is not drawn to that. And then when he finds out what that involves, that can be pretty terrifying, to find out that this God that you read about, this is what he's like. He is love, but he is also righteous and holy. And so we have to be, I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was alive during World War II and actually interred in prison camps. He wrote a book before that where he talked about cheap grace. And if you ever make grace come without a price, then what you've done is you have robbed the gospel of its transformative power. You've created what he called, I think his phrase was cheap grace. And so maybe that might be what we see here, Tim. What do you think? That it's a message about God's grace, but it's not cheap. It costs everything.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like that you can triangle of judgment, which I have to assume what Paul was talking about, the connection of righteousness, judgment, and self-control is probably you can deliver the Jonathan Edwards style sinners in the hand of an angry God sermon if you want to, okay, sorry, I'm having some network problems. All right, so what I was going to say is that it seemed like that Paul raised the stakes on Felix when he started linking God's grace and self-control and judgment all together. It's a lot easier if one or more of those pieces is out of the equation.
So what do you guys think about Festus and the reason why he leaves Paul in prison?
So, Stephen, before you get to
sure.
Festus, I think the end of the second half of verse 26, where it says that Felix sent for him often and conversed with him, kind of tells me that Paul's message wasn't just about the coming judgment, that there was an opportunity to avoid God's wrath and have forgiveness. And if we just leave verse 25, you kind of think, oh, maybe he gave him the doom and gloom that you're going to get what's coming to you, but that's clearly not what Paul's message was to Felix.
Yeah, otherwise they're done talking.
Tim Beaver had mentioned that some of this had to be coming from Felix's side as well. And he said that Drusilla, of course, daughter of Herod, long line of evil leaders who had killed some of God's servants. He might be feeling fear because of his own life, because of what his wife's family represented to the Jews. And it may have just been that he realized his own corruption in so many portions of his life. But there is, he had plenty of reasons, I guess, is what Tim was saying, to have a lot of fear when Paul started bringing up self-control.
Any other thoughts before we move down into Festus, which will really take us through verse 12 of chapter 25?
Yeah, one quick thing. I was reading some of Josephus's accounts and everything. It's interesting to me. I didn't know this, that when they made the changeover from Felix to Festus, then Emperor Nero actually came into power about that time. And what we know about the way he handled stuff, I bet he was a little bit uncomfortable during the time in which he had to step down and be replaced by Festus. So just a little sideline.
All right, so the first thing we see Festus doing is go down to Jerusalem. Not the very first thing, but after 3 days. And so he's going to go from Caesarea down to Jerusalem. It's interesting that when he gets there, he kind of jumps right in to the governance, and he's going to go probably to meet with the Jewish leaders and discuss the affairs of the province. And it's been about 2 years. And the Jewish leaders have not forgotten about Paul. There's a brand new governor, and one of the things they bring up in the first meeting with the brand new governor is, hey, there's a prisoner. Let's deal with him. I thought that was interesting. What did you guys notice through that first half of chapter 25?
Well, right off the bat, it's the fact that Festus shuts them down really quick when they say, "Hey, why can't we just take this down to Jerusalem, guys?" And Festus just said, "No, Paul's in Caesarea. Why don't you come up with me? I'm going that way. Why don't you come up with me, and we'll bring charges then." Again, these Roman governors just seem to all of a sudden grow scruples when it comes to God's people. I'm not sure how exactly that happens, but.
It really fits with the idea that God uses the nations to accomplish his purpose. Because I can't explain it either. It doesn't.
He also mentions that he shows Paul once again. He says, "Okay, here are 3 things they might charge against me." And he says, and here are 3 things I'll tell you right now I didn't do. I haven't offended the law. I haven't offended Caesar. I haven't offended the temple. So he sort of heads it off right away. They may have brought lots of charges, but they can't prove any of them.
Yeah. And that's I had somebody describe to me the difference between public opinion and a court of law is that public opinion, there's nothing that public opinion is based on. It's whatever people want to believe. But in a court of law, you have to prove it. And so here, when they're actually in dealing with facts, they've got nothing against Paul. So yeah, I think you're exactly right, Tim. There's also maybe to kind of again build upon what Eddie said at the beginning about Felix. Festus, I don't remember the years, but Festus really isn't governor for that long. But he does seem to be trying to do the opposite of what Felix did.
Well, I read, yeah.
Yeah, he's trying to kind of bring Rome and Jerusalem together. And it doesn't work. But that seems to be what he's continually trying to do favors for the Jews. And so that seems to be what he's doing.
Debbie asked when I made the mention of scruples. She said she made the point scruples about God's people or about a Roman citizen, and that's it's very possible. I was sort of thinking of Pilate or throwing Pilate in there with Jesus as well, thinking about the way that God has already used one Roman governor before that. So that's the only reason I said that. But absolutely, they seem to, and especially Festus, who seems to want to at least not be like his tribune. He doesn't want to have Paul be mistreated at any point, whether it's on the way to Jerusalem or whatever. He doesn't want to seem to have that happen. So it may well be that Festus has a little bit different motivation than the others, especially because, like Felix, he comes back and eventually wants to do the Jews a favor, interestingly enough, and then he's going to come back with pretty much exactly the opposite of what he told the Jews, right? He's going to say, okay, so you ready to come down to Jerusalem, be tried for this stuff?
I wonder if that was just to show them who's in charge. Now, you're going to come all the way to Caesarea first, and then after you do that, then we'll go to Jerusalem. I wonder if there was some of that. And that I agree that when you start dealing with the citizenship that Paul has, that really complicates things. If he's just a Jew, this is very simple. But the fact that he is a citizen, it allows him to have access to people that he wouldn't have otherwise had access to. And that makes me think perhaps with the benefits that we have in our citizenship, Paul doesn't use the citizenship, it doesn't seem, solely for his personal benefit. He's using it for the benefit of spreading the gospel. And me, as an American citizen or a U.S. citizen, am I doing the same thing with the privileges that I have? Am I using them for my benefit, or am I using them for the benefit of the gospel? And that's a hard question. So let's talk about the appeal to Caesar. Nero is coming to power, or has come to power, depending on when we think these things are happening. But I think most people believe that Nero has recently come to power. When he's a young guy, when he's younger, he tends to be, his personal life is a mess, but as far as being a Caesar, he tends to be a more benevolent ruler. It seems to be when people come to power at the beginning, they want to kind of win the favor of their people. And he loved plays and poetry. He's a really nice, if you were away from his family, he seemed to be a fairly benevolent ruler at the beginning. And so when Paul appeals to this Caesar, he may have had that Caesar in mind, not knowing what Nero is eventually going to become. And so that might help explain why he appeals to Caesar.
That would, yeah.
He's not appealing to the madman who will do just unspeakable things later.
Well, the other side of this is I'm not 100% sure that he was so interested in appealing to the specific Caesar as he was simply saying, look, I'm putting my hands in Rome, I'm putting myself in Rome's hands through all of this. I did it already. I'm a Roman citizen. If the way for me to not be thrown back with the Jews, if the only way is to make the ultimate appeal, then I'm making the ultimate appeal, because it's, what he says about appealing to Caesar is specifically in response to what Festus has just asked, which is, hey, you want to go to Jerusalem and be tried on this stuff. And immediately Paul's response is, look, I'm at Caesar's tribunal. I'm exactly the place where I want to be. And if the only answer to that is I'm gonna be tried at or by Caesar himself, so be it.
Yeah, we already know what's going to happen in Jerusalem. I mean, there's not much of a trial there. And this, I think you're right. That does seem to be the only path to Rome. He's not going to get there another way.
Tim Beaver mentioned that in Acts 23, God has told Paul that he would testify in Rome. Mm-hmm. So, again, this goes back to this idea of Paul had an idea going and needed to be, and this is the direct route. So, I think that there's a lot to that. Can I go back just for a second to something that he says to Festus that I find almost amazing? And it's, I don't want to say audacity, but kind of audacity. He says, to the Jews, I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. And that phrase, as you yourself know very well, the obvious retort to that is, then why would you have to take me to Jerusalem and adjudicate my case? I mean, he's basically saying to Festus, look, I know what you're saying here, but you already know the answers. So there's only going to be one other reason why I'd be going down to Jerusalem, and it's not good. Because he says, you know this very well. He says, there seems to be, Paul seems to be calling him out on that, and Festus doesn't chop his head off. So I guess there's truth to that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's also easy to read through this passage and just skip the fact that multiple years have passed by in this. It's almost a blip on the radar when you realize he's been in prison waiting for 2 years for something to come up with this. And you kind of get that feel from the language he uses when he talks to Festus, like Tim just said, but also when he goes on in verse 11, if I'm in wrongdoer, committing and having committed anything deserving to die, I don't seek to escape death. He's just basically almost seems like he just wants something to be done. He wants something to take place and this to be over one way or the other. And the boldness that he has with Festus, I think, is indicative of that.
All right. Well, we're about out of time. If nobody has any other thoughts before we finish out, I'll ask Eddie if you have any announcements that need to be made, and if you'd like to close us with a prayer.
Everybody got I should have an email by now on the bulletin and everything. There's one additional person that Don didn't mention this morning. That was Jill Norris is having surgery on her foot this coming Thursday. So along with her and little Carly Nash tomorrow is having surgery, as Eric indicated this morning. So by all means, remember them. Also remember the continuation of the study of Daniel on Wednesday evening with Stephen. So that's the only additional stuff that I have. So if you bow with me, I'll close us out in a prayer. Our loving Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for this opportunity we've had at this afternoon hour to come together by this virtual means and to open up the Word and to study together. We're so grateful for your Word and for the enrichment it brings to our lives. We would help us ever to stand firm in your Word and help us to have that inner spiritual strength that we need to grow in faith as we study and meditate upon it. Father, we thank you so much for all that you have done for us. We thank you for your love and for your grace and for every blessing that you have bestowed upon us. We thank you for the blessing of our church family and for the love and the care that's shown by all toward one another, and for the good that has been accomplished through both individual and collective efforts. We are mindful, Father, of several of our number and extended family members that are struggling with various health issues and other difficulties in life. And we would ask, Father, at this time that you would bless them in a special way and that you're suiting to them their needs as you see best and comfort them only as you can. Help us, Father, to always put you first in our life, to keep our focus on you and to share your love for you that with those that are round about us. Please forgive us of our sins. We love you and we thank you for Jesus. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.